Now, I'm really well aware that much of this seems very complex. The nature of argument forms, lots of P's and Q's all over the place, and weird terms like modus ponens and affirmation of the consequent. However, there is some good news. While it's beneficial if you can understand and remember these argument forms and their names, although you may want to try and get out a little bit more, the important point is that the four inferences associated with conditional statements under the standard interpretation, there are two valid inference forms, the modus ones, modus ponens and modus tollens, and two invalid ones, the affirmation of the consequent and the denial of the antecedent. It is this information that puts us in the position that we really want to be in. We now know which inferences are valid and which inferences are invalid. And this means that we are in a position to start asking participants to do some reasoning, and that we have a way to assess whether they are right or wrong. If they draw the valid inferences and fail to draw the invalid ones, then they are reasoning well. Whereas if they fail to draw the valid ones but draw the invalid ones, then they are not reasoning accurately. For a long time, philosophers had thought that the laws of logic were the language of thought. But it was not until psychologists started to closely examine how well people reasoned that we were able to develop a real picture of the nature of human reasoning. Now, when we want to examine participants' reasoning skills, there are a number of ways that we can go about it. We can give them the two premises and ask them what follows. We can give them the two premises and a conclusion and ask them to say whether the offered conclusion follows. Or we can give them the two premises and a list of possible conclusions, and we can ask them which of the conclusions offered follows. The list normally includes that nothing follows from these premises. Since the cognitive psychology revolution of the 1950s and 1960s, there has been a lot of research that has examined reasoning behaviour, and there is a wide variety of findings due to factors like the type of the task used, like the ones I just described, or what the task is about. Is it about real things, like children playing in the sun, or is it presented in its rather abstract form in terms of P's and Q's or other letters or numbers? There are advantages and disadvantages to both of these. If it is about P's and Q's, then you may get a measure of pure, uncontaminated reasoning ability. But on the other hand, the reality is that we tend to reason about things like sunshine and children playing. So this is a more realistic task in many ways. These factors can have a large effect on reasoning, and so results vary widely from one study to another. And it is this that, in part, makes the study of reasoning so interesting. Theories must be able to capture all of this variability. Evans, Newstead and Byrne in 1993 collated the findings from a number of studies and presented them as an overall picture of reasoning ability. These studies were all of the abstract type, about letters and numbers. The graph on the slide clearly shows that modus ponens, this inference, is endorsed almost universally. And as this is a valid inference, then this is indicative of good reasoning ability. However, the modus tollens inference is endorsed less frequently at around 60%. And as a valid inference, this should also be endorsed universally like the modus ponens inference. So this suggests some weakness in reasoning here. Finally, the two invalid inferences are endorsed some of the time by some people at just below 40%. This suggests some limitation in reasoning ability because these inferences should be rejected. However, remember that under other interpretations of conditional statements, these conclusions can be valid, and in reality, we do not know what interpretation our participants have adopted, so we can't say with any certainty that the conclusions drawn here are definitely wrong in relation to the AC and DA inferences. In summary then, and this is the important point, what we end up with is a mixed picture, and these findings have been replicated many times. There is a strong case to show that the valid MP inference is drawn easily and universally, whereas the MT inference appears to be harder and is drawn less often. The two invalid inferences are also drawn reasonably frequently, so we have a mixed picture that suggests that although there is some reasoning ability, there is also some level of error, and it is this that makes the study of reasoning so interesting. How can we capture this competency and inability to reason in one overarching theory? There are numerous theoretical approaches that attempt to capture this pattern of performance, some more successfully than others, and we can consider one aspect of one such theory briefly here. The notion of mental logic, that where appropriate we apply the rules of logic, has many supporters and appears in numerous forms, such as that of Brain and O'Brien, 1991, and Rips's lucid 1994 account. Although they are different, they all share enough for them to be considered as a whole here. Brain and O'Brien would argue that we hold the rule for modus ponens in our minds. This is the easy, almost universal inference. Hence, this rule is easily applied and we see the endorsement rate reported earlier, almost universal endorsement. However, there is no corresponding single rule for modus tollens, the less frequently endorsed valid inference. To successfully draw this inference, there need to be several steps of reasoning completed, some of which are quite complex, and it is this extra processing requirement that leads to the lower endorsement rate of this inference.
Assuming they're not coming for us.
No. Last little bit now.
Yeah.
Do you want me to go over that last bit again? All right. Okay. In summary then, we have seen that logic and deduction are important for our day-to-day functioning, that there are valid and invalid inferences depending on how the conditional is interpreted, and that there is a reasonable level of reasoning competence, but that it is far from perfect, and that there are theoretical approaches that have attempted to account for and explain the pattern of results that we have seen. I hope that you have enjoyed this introduction to the nature of reasoning, and that this will spur you on to read a little more about this fascinating area of cognitive psychology.